What up, y'all? Welcome to Marx in the House, a show where we talk about what we talk about when we talk about gentrification. We've seen how gentrification played out in the US, and we've seen the different patterns it took on in the global south. Now, I know we've taken in a whole lot of different information, and we're almost ready to put it all together. Today is our last stop, our last historical examination of the gentrification process. After today, you'll be a beginning expert, ready to investigate conditions in your local neighborhood. But before that, we're gonna dive deep into the source of all the world's problems: Europe. Can't afford rent, getting gentrified. Marx in the house, about to tell you why. Now, to ease the blow of being in the home of colonialism, we're gonna start in the less shitty part: Eastern Europe. Hungary, to be exact. Now, Hungary was part of the Eastern Soviet squad. God, there's just so many caveats in that one sentence alone. You might think Hungary was one of those communist countries. It wasn't. In the description, there's a link to a video on the difference between socialism and communism. I should probably update it, but anyway. Was it socialist? That's debatable. And that debate is for another video series. All we need to know right now is that the state controlled a lot of the sectors of the country's economy. So on the one hand, the privatization of housing was already a formal housing policy as early as 1969. And trust, privatizing housing is not a part of any socialist scoop. But just because something's a policy doesn't mean that it's actually being implemented. The state, for the most part, had a strong centralized control over housing construction and allocation until the 80s. The levels of privatization differed per city though. Overall, even in the early 80s in Hungary, there were only low levels of privatization in housing. But the exception here is Budapest. Already in 1975, only 67% of its housing was publicly owned. The more that the entire country started to be privatized, the more the suburbs expanded and more prices started to inflate. Ooh, I sense a nice little rent gap coming. This was a slow process though. Everything changed in 1989. The fall of the Soviet Union coincided with all democratic socialist pretenses in Hungary evaporating. As we saw in previous episodes, a lot of countries pushed through neoliberal reforms after they went bankrupt. In Hungary, there was no bankruptcy or defaulting on loans. It was a massive political reform from democratic socialism to full-blown neoliberal capitalism. So guess what happened in Budapest? Yep, the city center became a core for capital accumulation. Remember, we're in 1989 at this point, so finance capital and capital in general circulated more freely from imperialist countries, always thirsting for that highest rate of return. And all of a sudden, the housing market in Budapest was free game. And it wasn't just Budapest, it was all over the Eastern Bloc. The privatization of housing that happened might have been part of the largest transfer of property rights in history. Budapest itself attracted about $5 billion in foreign commercial investments in 4 years after 1989. This massive reinvestment looked exactly like you'd expect. Major European developers, along with German banks and American powerhouses like Procter & Gamble, all invested in the city. Gone were the days of affordable housing. But hey, at least there were expensive restaurants, clubs, and night spots most couldn't afford. Now they were just like most other cities in the world. One of us, one of us, one of us. It was also literally in autumn 1989 that the first houseless people started to appear in Hungary. Before this point, it was almost unheard of. Capitalism. So how was Budapest gentrification different than the classic investment, disinvestment, reinvestment pattern? It's the disinvestment part. You see, after World War II, there was a whole bunch of people in Budapest with no house. Post-war housing policy was focused on solving this problem. This meant the construction of a large number of small and simple social housing units on the outskirts of the existing cities. So yes, construction took place outside of inner cities like in the US. But in Budapest, this investment was for actual affordable housing in locations where people actually needed it. The investment pattern sort of looked the same, but one invested in exchange value, the other use value. Very different effects on actual human beings. But capital doesn't see nor care about these effects. It has no eyes after all. The only thing that mattered to it was that there was disinvestment in the center and investment in the outer rings. And the disinvestment in the center had been ongoing for at least half a century. So when privatization hit, it was gentrification time. Still carefully, cause, it's the early 90s. Investment started in an arc, block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood. The arc went around the government and business centers in a city. By the summer of '93, 35% of public housing stock was privatized. The public sector had shrunk to only 32% of all housing. Budapest had become part of the world market. And now with this early reinvestment certified, land values all around the city started to skyrocket. How was all of this funded? After all, we know that we need sweet mortgage credit to make sure demand keeps up with supply. And despite all this capital investment, by the mid-90s there was still no significant mortgage credit in place. So the consumption side of gentrification was funded in one of three main ways. 1. Some people had saved up money to rehabilitate their own apartments or buy or rent previous apartment that had some work done. 2. If these personal funds needed a little boost, people could borrow loans which in the mid-90s had an interest rate of 30 to 35%. Big fucking yikes. 3. Both national and international corporations would sometimes underwrite housing for their employees. This was construction, rehabilitation, rental and purchase of luxury apartments, pretty much anything real estate. Now this is all a complicated way of saying that major companies help their employees get housing. Aside from this, gentrified apartments were also sold or rented to foreign professionals who already had the guapo mundo. And gentrification in Budapest has been taken off since. While Hungary, at least for a while, had some socialist policies, the Netherlands on the other hand has always been capitalist. Very capitalist. Ugh. But at the same time, of all the capitalist nations, there's barely been a country that has intervened in the housing market as extensively as the Netherlands. By the end of the 1970s, which remember is around the beginning of the global neoliberal turn, Dutch cities were following two classic urban patterns of the imperialist core. This meant both the loss of traditional urban jobs, aka deindustrialization, and the suburbanization of office and urban jobs. Up to this point, social housing projects were pretty solid because of a history of squatting and class struggle. But by the end of the 1970s, these were being abandoned and the private sector was encouraged to take care of housing. In 1989, does that year sound familiar? A housing policy was implemented that dismantled the Dutch system of subsidies and regulation. This privatization was different than in Britain and the US though. Instead of privatizing social housing, it was geared towards new construction. And because there had been tight state regulation of land and housing markets up to that point, cities like Amsterdam never experienced disinvestment through the private market like the US did. Buildings were rarely abandoned, and if they were squatted up. So where did the rent gap in a city like Amsterdam come from? Rent control. Rent control kept rents real low. Low rent means low sale prices. But with high land value, that equals a big fat fucking rent gap in inner city housing. So listen, we can all fight for rent control, right? But this is a temporary concession that the ruling class makes to pacify workers. So it's not that low rents are a bad thing, but that it's temporary. Until we get rid of capitalism, we're gonna keep fighting for reforms. Then they'll be taken away, then they'll be given again, and so on. Same shit happened in Holland. When state controls were relaxed, which means when the reforms were taken away, gentrification slowly creeped in from property to property. Often this happened with a shift in tenure. This means a switch from rental to ownership, from partly subsidized housing to fully privatization, from non-residential to residential, you name it, buddy. In the US, oftentimes the state subsidized gentrification from the beginning. In Amsterdam, this was a slower process. It was only through loopholes and small openings in housing policies that gentrification slowly became public policy. Another qualitative difference between the US and Europe is that the latter often had older cribs, which means longer cycles of disinvestment. This is most intense in Paris, where neighborhoods undergoing gentrification were constructed between the 16th and 18th century. Most neighborhoods in the urban core have been dominated by the bourgeoisie, while the suburbs have historically been working class. So gentrification in Paris started out scattered in the suburbs. This started out later than in Britain and the US because most housing stock there was rent control till 1978. Aside from that, juicy mortgage capital was lacking because of France's tight restriction on banking capital. A 1977 Housing Act changed all that. The bank started offering low-interest mortgages to prospective homeowners. Gentrification followed. Following the theme of rent control, it might be helpful to step outside of Europe for a second and venture to Cairo. Private investors have been trying to capitalize on its historic downtown area cause, you know, tourism equals land value. But gentrification hasn't taken off because of rent control and legal fights. At the same time, potential gentrifiers, mainly young couples, are unable to borrow from banks to buy and restore apartments downtown. But getting loans to purchase real estate in new desert communities is mad easy, so that's where they're going to. But of course, the longer downtown stays disinvested, the bigger and juicier that rent gap is gonna be. And that's because the rest of the adjacent real estate market is booming. It's that finger-licking capitalist logic of uneven development. The development of one area creates barriers for further development. The more you invest in it, the harder it is to squeeze money out of it. This leads to underdevelopment, which creates opportunities for new development. Gotta love it. We did it, y'all! Next week we're gonna start synthesizing all this sweet information. Thank you so much for watching and see you at the next one. Peace, Space Baby out.